On the morning of March 3, 1943, 6,900 Japanese soldiers were sailing toward New Guinea on 8 transports, escorted by 8 destroyers, under the air cover of 100 Zero fighters. 1,200 of them would reach land. Nearly 4,000 would die in the next 15 minutes and the days that followed, most of them inside the holds of ships that never had a chance to fight back. The weapon that killed them had been built 6 months earlier in a tropical hangar in Australia by a 43-year-old American with no engineering degree, working with parts he had pulled out of fighter planes the Army had thrown away. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn. His friends called him Pappy. His wife and his 4 children were starving inside a Japanese prison camp 200 miles from the convoy he was about to destroy, and he did not know if any of them were still alive. This is how it happened. Dawn over the Bismarck Sea, March 3, 1943. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the open bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki and watched his convoy hold its formation against a grey horizon. 8 transports in 2 columns, 8 destroyers ringing them like a steel fence. The sea ran easy. The morning was clear. Somewhere above the clouds, Zeros from the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul were already turning their lazy circles overhead. Kimura had every reason to believe his ships would reach Lae. Japanese naval doctrine had answers for every kind of American attack he had ever seen. High-altitude bombers missed. Torpedo planes died on the approach. Anti-aircraft fire from 8 destroyers formed what the manuals called an umbrella of steel. Kimura had sailed these waters before. He had watched American bombs fall into empty ocean. He had survived. What he did not know, what no Japanese naval officer could have known, was that the rules he had survived under no longer applied. Within 4 hours, his flagship would have her stern blown off. Within 15 minutes after that, every transport in his convoy would be burning. And the man who had made it possible would never set eyes on the ships he had helped to kill. Manila, December 8, 1941. Across the international dateline, the smoke from Pearl Harbor was still rising. Paul Irvin Gunn stood on the tarmac at Nielsen Field and listened to the sirens climb. He was 42 years old, lean, hard-faced, a man who looked like he had been carved out of weather. His friends called him Pappy because he was a decade older than most of the pilots he flew with. His enemies in time would have other names for him. Gunn had spent 21 years in the United States Navy. Aircraft mechanic, enlisted naval aviator, flight instructor at Pensacola. He had retired in December 1939 as a chief petty officer, taken his savings, and built something the Navy could never have given him. He owned an airline, Philippine Airlines, 4 Beechcraft Model 18 transports, all of them painted red, because his wife Polly loved the color and the planes were as much hers as they were his. Polly was 20 years his wife. 4 children carried his name. 2 boys, Paul Jr. and Nathan. 2 girls, Connie and Julie. On the morning the war began, they were sleeping in the family house on Dewey Boulevard, less than a mile from the harbor where Japanese bombs would fall within hours. Pappy Gunn did the only thing he knew how to do. He went his airplanes. For the next 3 weeks, while the U.S. Army Air Forces in the Philippines was destroyed on its own runways, Gunn flew the 4 red Beechcrafts out of Manila and back again. He carried wounded officers, he carried codebooks, he carried medical supplies to the besieged garrison on Bataan, flying an unarmored civilian aircraft into airspace patrolled by Zero fighters. For that, the Army would later award him the Distinguished Flying Cross. He did not fly to win medals. He flew because every flight he made for the Army was a flight he could not make for his family. By the time he tried to come back for them, it was too late. Manila had been declared an open city. The Japanese were marching down Dewey Boulevard. Polly and the 4 children had been herded with 3,000 other Americans into the University of Santo Tomas, where the gates had closed behind them on January 4, 1942. Gunn was ordered south. He flew the last of the Beechcrafts to Australia, carrying generals and intelligence officers, and the kind of men a defeated army cannot afford to lose. He did not carry his wife. He did not carry his children. He carried other people's families to safety, and he flew away from his own. There is a photograph of him from this period. He is not looking at the camera, he is looking past it, at something the camera cannot see. He did not know in those first months whether they were alive. The United States Army Air Forces commissioned him as a captain. They could think of no better use for a 42-year-old former chief petty officer than logistics. They sent him to Brisbane to push paper. Pappy Gunn did not push paper. He walked into the hangars at Eagle Farm Airfield, where the A-20 Havoc light bombers of the 3rd Attack Group sat in rows without bomb sights, without bomb racks, without any of the weapons they had been promised. The aircraft had arrived from the factory half finished. The war was not waiting. Gunn went out to the boneyard at the edge of the field. He counted the wrecks. He counted what could be salvaged from them. He counted the 50 caliber Browning machine guns lying in the wings of dead P-40s and dead P-39s, guns the Army considered unrepairable, guns nobody had a use for. He had a use for them. In late summer of 1942, working with a North American aviation field representative named Jack Fox, Pappy Gunn began bolting 50 caliber machine guns into the noses of A-20 Havocs. 4 guns in the nose, 2 more in pods on each side of the fuselage. The guns were not authorized. The modifications were not approved. The work was being done by a 42-year-old captain who had never set foot in a Navy engineering school, using parts he had taken from wrecks the Army had written off. When Major General George Churchill Kenny arrived in Australia in August of 1942 to take command of the 5th Air Force, he found Pappy Gunn in a hangar at Eagle Farm with grease on his hands and a cigarette in his mouth, installing fighter guns into a bomber nobody had asked him to modify. Kenny looked at the work. Kenny looked at Gunn. Kenny made him a member of his personal staff that afternoon. "You're my special projects officer," Kenny told him. "Make me more of these." This was the first turn the story took that nobody in Tokyo and nobody in Washington could have predicted. The weapon that would shatter Japan's ability to move by sea was not being built in an arsenal. It was not being designed by engineers. It was being welded together in a tropical hangar by a man who had retired from the Navy as an enlisted sailor and whose technical education had been everything he could teach himself while keeping somebody else's airplanes flying. The A-20s went into combat in September of 1942. They tore up the Japanese airfield at Buna with strafing runs nobody had thought possible. Kenny watched the gun camera footage and gave his next order. He wanted the same thing done to the B-25 Mitchell. He wanted the bombardier removed from the nose. He wanted the nose filled with guns. 4 guns to start, then 6. Then 8. He called what he wanted a commerce destroyer. It was a quiet phrase for what the aircraft was actually being built to do. The engineers at Wright Field in Ohio received the blueprints by courier. They read them. They wrote back that the work was impossible. The center of gravity, they said, would be wrong. The aircraft would be tail light. The recoil of 850 caliber machine guns firing in unison would tear the nose structure apart in the first burst. The modification was dangerous. The aircraft should be grounded. The man responsible should be removed from his position. The man responsible was, by this point, Captain Pappy Gunn. He read the message from Wright Field. He sent his reply through Kenny's office. "Put the center of gravity in storage for the duration," it said. "We have a war to fight." He did not sign it. The work continued. Gunn and Jack Fox solved the recoil problem by reinforcing the nose frame with steel they had milled themselves. They solved the ammunition feed by running belts through spaces the manufacturer had designed for bomb-aiming optics. They solved the gas blast problem on the side-mounted package guns by extending the barrels in steel tubes past the propeller arc, where the flash would not peel the skin off the airplane's flank. Every problem had an answer, and the answers were not in any manual, because no manual had been written for an aircraft that did not exist. 3,000 miles to the north, the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo was reaching a decision of its own. Guadalcanal had been abandoned in February of 1943. The garrison at Leh had to be reinforced. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army at Rabaul, looked at the map with Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa and saw that there was only one way to do it. The 51st Division would have to be carried directly from Rabaul to Leh through the Bismarck Sea in daylight, within range of Allied air bases at Port Moresby and Dobodura. The 18 Army staff wargamed the operation. They expected to lose 4 of their 10 transports. They estimated the chance of success at 1 in 2. They gave the order anyway. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi boarded the destroyer Tokitsukaze. Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano of the 51st Division boarded the destroyer Yukiikaze. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura raised his flag aboard Shirayuki. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, 6,900 soldiers. The convoy cleared rubble just after midnight on February 28, 1943. They did not know that in a hangar at Eagle Farm, the first squadron of B-25 Commerce destroyers had finished its modifications 3 weeks earlier. They did not know that the codebreakers at Frumel in Melbourne had already read their sailing orders. They did not know that the man who had designed the weapon waiting for them had a wife and 4 children inside a prison camp at the University of Santo Tomas, 200 miles to the west of where they were left, and that he had not seen those children in 14 months, and did not know if they were still alive. They knew only what Japanese naval doctrine had taught them. Within 4 days, that doctrine would be dead. Brisbane, late autumn 1942. The hangar at Eagle Farm smelled of avgas and hot metal and the particular sweetness of cordite that gets into a man's clothes and never quite washes out. Pappy Gunn worked with his sleeves rolled up and his tie tucked into the front of his shirt the way a mechanic does when he plans to be inside a cowling before lunchtime. The Australian heat poured through the open hangar doors. Sweat ran into his eyes. He did not wipe it away. He was standing on a wooden crate, looking down the gutted nose of a B-25C Mitchell. The plexiglass bombardier's cone had been cut away. The bomb sight had been pulled and crated for shipment back to the depot. The space inside the nose, which the North American aviation engineers in Inglewood, California, had designed for a man and his instruments, was now empty. Jack Fox stood beside him with a clipboard. Fox was the factory's field representative. He had been sent to Australia to keep the airplanes flying. He had not been sent to help a former chief petty officer carve up the airframes North American had spent 2 years designing. But Fox had been in Brisbane long enough to understand that Pappy Gunn was not asking permission, and that the better part of wisdom in this hangar was to hand the man the right tools and write the modifications down on paper so that, when Washington asked questions, somebody could give them an answer. 4 guns, Gunn said. He held up 4 fingers, black with grease, then 6, then 8. Fox looked at the empty nose. He looked at the 450 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns laid out on the hangar floor, salvaged from the wreck of a P-40 that had cartwheeled at Townsville 2 months earlier. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. Each gun fired 850 rounds a minute. Each round was longer than a man's index finger and traveled faster than the sound it made leaving the barrel. 8 guns, Fox said. All firing at once, the nose will come apart. Gunn climbed down from the crate. He took the clipboard out of Fox's hand. He drew a sketch on the top page in pencil, a cross-section of the B-25's nose, with steel plates running diagonally from the gun mounts to the main spar. He was not a draftsman. The drawing was crude, but anyone who had ever welded a thing to another thing could see what he meant. It won't come apart, he said. We'll reinforce it. Fox looked at the sketch. He looked at Gunn. He picked up the first machine gun. The first reinforcements broke. They cracked along the welds the first time the guns were tested. Gunn redesigned them in pencil on the back of a cigarette pack while standing on the apron. The second reinforcements held for 50 rounds and then deformed. The third version held. The fourth was better. By the time Gunn was satisfied, the nose of a B-25 weighed 800 pounds more than it had when the airplane left Inglewood. The center of gravity had moved nearly a foot forward. By November, the nose of a B-25 weighed 800 pounds more than it had when the airplane left the factory. The center of gravity had moved nearly a foot forward. When the modification reports reached Brisbane through official channels, General Kenny read them once and filed them in the drawer where he kept the things Washington did not need to know about. He went out to Eagle Farm and watched Pappy Gunn take a fully modified B-25 down the runway at full throttle, hold the nose wheel on the concrete past the speed any test pilot would have allowed, and lift off with 2,000 pounds of guns and ammunition packed forward of the firewall. The airplane climbed, the airplane handled, the airplane came back down without complaint. Kenny walked over to Gunn when he taxied in. He had read Wrightfield's report that morning. He looked at the airplane that had just touched down on its main gear like any other bomber in the Army. He looked at the man who had built it. Kenny never forwarded Wrightfield's recommendation up the chain. He filed it in a drawer and went on with the war. While Pappy Gunn was bolting guns into bomber noses, another American officer was solving the other half of the problem. His name was Major William Garland Benn. He was 34 years old, a West Point graduate, and he commanded the 63rd Bombardment Squadron of the 43rd Bombardment Group, flying B-17 Flying Fortresses out of Port Moresby. Ben had read a British report on something the Royal Air Force was trying in the Mediterranean, dropping bombs at low altitude into the sides of ships, letting the bombs skip across the water like a flat stone on a pond, slamming into the hull at the waterline where the steel was thinnest. The British called it masthead bombing. The Americans in time would call it skip bombing. Ben took his B-17s out to a reef near Port Moresby where the merchant ship SS Pruth had grounded herself before the war. He flew at the wreck. He dropped practice bombs from 200 feet at 300 miles an hour. He learned what worked. He learned what killed you. He came back to Port Moresby and wrote down what he had discovered. A bomb released at the right altitude, at the right speed, at the right distance from the ship, would bounce once across the surface of the water and strike the target below the waterline. A 4 to 5 second delay fuse would give it time to penetrate the hull before it exploded. The bomb would detonate inside the engine room, inside the magazine, inside the soft places where a ship died. The accuracy was extraordinary. Pilots who had been missing ships by hundreds of yards from 12,000 feet were now placing bombs within 10 feet of where they had aimed them. It was Kenny who saw what the two innovations meant together. 8 50 caliber machine guns in the nose of a B-25 could silence the deck of a Japanese destroyer before the bomber reached release point. Skip bombs released into the side of that destroyer would open her hull at the waterline. The guns would kill the gun crews. The bombs would kill the ship. The pilot would do it all in 8 seconds, from 100 feet above the ocean. By the end of February 1943, the 90th Bombardment Squadron at Port Moresby, call sign Pero Dice, had a dozen B-25s configured for the new attack. The squadron commander was Major Edward Larner, 28 years old, hard as a tire iron, the kind of man who walked toward problems rather than away from them. His pilots trained against the wreck of the Pruth until they could put a 500-pound bomb through a window from 100 yards out. They flew so low that their propeller wash-kicked spray off the water in white trails behind them. They did not know what they were training for. They were told only to be ready. 1,200 miles to the north, the codebreakers at Frumel in Melbourne had been reading Imperial Japanese Navy traffic since the first weeks of the war. On February 16, 1943, they decrypted a message that named the destination of every convoy the Japanese intended to sail in the coming weeks. Wewak, Madang, Lai. The Lai convoy would carry the main body of the 51st Division. It would sail from Rabaul during the last week of February. It would attempt to land its troops on March 5th. The decrypts were passed to Kenny. Kenny spread them out on his desk in Brisbane and looked at the dates and the courses. He did not need a war college to tell him what he was looking at. He was looking at 6,000 Japanese soldiers in a box. He gave the order. Every bomber the 5th Air Force could put in the air would be ready. The B-17s would attack from altitude. The B-25s of Larner's squadron would attack from the wavetops. The Australians, flying Beaufighters out of Port Moresby, would go in first. By the time the convoy cleared Rabaul, just after midnight on the 28th of February, every piece of the Allied trap was in place. The codebreakers in Melbourne had read the destination. The B-25 strafers were standing on the line at Port Moresby. The Beaufighters were fueled and armed. Kenny was waiting. A tropical storm closed over the Solomon Sea on the night of the 1st of March. The convoy disappeared into it. Allied search aircraft flew through rain and lost contact. For 36 hours the Japanese sailed unseen. Then the weather broke. On the afternoon of March 2nd, a B-24 Liberator from the 321st Bombardment Squadron found a tear in the clouds and saw the convoy crawling beneath it at 7 knots. The pilot radioed his contact report. Within 2 hours, 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 43rd Bombardment Group were over the convoy at 7,000 feet, dropping 1,000-pound bombs. They hit the transport Kyokusei Maru. She caught fire. She sank within an hour. The destroyers Asugumo and Yukikaze pulled 850 soldiers from the water, ran them ahead to lay through the night at flank speed, put them ashore, and turned around. They rejoined the convoy before dawn. Aboard the Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura received the damage reports. 1 transport lost, 850 troops saved. 7 transports still afloat, 6,000 soldiers still bound for Lae. The Americans had attacked from altitude as Japanese doctrine had predicted, and Japanese doctrine had held. The convoy continued. This was the first turn that the men in the destroyers could not see. They believed they had been tested and had survived. They believed the worst was behind them. The worst had not yet begun. The morning of March 3rd came up clear over the Huon Gulf. At Cape Ward Hunt on the north coast of Papua, 90 Allied aircraft formed up in the cool air at 3,000 feet. 13 Beaufighters of the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 30 Squadron, 12 B-25s of Lana's 90th Squadron, every one of them carrying the 8-gun nose Pappy gun, had welded together in Brisbane. 13 B-17s of the 43rd, 12 A-20 Havocs of the 3rd Attack Group, 16 P-38 Lightnings of the 39th Fighter Squadron flying high cover. The formation took 20 minutes to assemble in the sky. Nothing of this size had ever been put together over the southwest Pacific. They turned north toward the Bismarck Sea. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese lookouts saw the high-altitude formation first, the B-17s, the way they had always come. Every anti-aircraft gun on every ship in the convoy traversed upward, the 5-inch guns of the destroyers elevated to maximum. The 25mm mounts on the transports swung their barrels into the sun. Japanese doctrine called this the umbrella of steel. It was the answer to the question Japanese sailors had been trained to answer. It was the answer to the wrong question. The Beaufighters came in below the horizon, 20 feet above the water, 400 miles an hour. By the traditional account passed down through Allied airmen, the Japanese gunners first mistook them for torpedo planes and turned their ships broadside to comb the expected wakes, a story some modern historians have questioned. What is certain is what happened next. Each Beaufighter carried 4 20mm cannons in the nose and 6 303 machine guns in the wings. They opened fire at 600 yards. The bridges of the Japanese destroyers disintegrated. Plexiglass shattered. Officers folded forward over their binoculars. Helmsmen went down at their wheels. The bridge of the Shirayuki took the first hits. Admiral Kimura was knocked to the deck with shrapnel in his side. His captain was killed beside him. The fire control officer was killed. The signalman was killed. The men who had been trained to fight the ship were not killed all at once, but quickly enough that no orders went out for the next 90 seconds, and 90 seconds was longer than the ship had. Behind the Beaufighters came the B-25s. Major Edward Lana led them in at 50 feet above the water at 280 miles an hour. The destroyers Lana had selected, the lead destroyers screening the transports, were still trying to bring their guns down through the depression stops to engage the wave-top attackers. Lana pressed the firing button on his control yoke. 8 50 caliber machine guns opened in the nose of his airplane. 6,800 rounds per minute, sustained for 8 seconds. 900 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary projectiles converging on the destroyer's bridge from a range of 1,200 yards. The rounds arrived before the sound did. The bridge windows blew inward. The men inside the bridge were cut down by a fire so dense that the destroyer's fragmentation shields, designed to stop bomb fragments, were peeled apart like cardboard. Then the bomb dropped, a 500-pound bomb with a 4-second delay fuse, released at 100 feet above the water at 280 miles an hour. The bomb skipped once. It struck the destroyer's hull below the waterline. It exploded inside her engineering spaces. Lana pulled up sharp. His tail gunner reported the destroyer's stern lifting and falling away as the magazine cooked off behind them. Behind Lana, 11 more B-25s was selecting targets across the convoy. Lieutenant John Hennebury, jock to his crew, 24 years old, jaw like a brick, made pass after pass on the convoy that morning, by one account 15 separate strafing and bombing runs. He emptied his guns, he emptied his bomb racks, he came back at the convoy a second time with whatever ammunition his turret gunner had left and his pilot's pistol on the seat beside him. The destroyer Tokitsukaze took a bomb in her engine room and went dead in the water. Lieutenant General Adachi and most of her crew were taken off by the destroyer Yukikaze before she went under. The destroyer Arashio lost her steering to 50 caliber rounds that severed her hydraulic lines, and she swung uncontrolled into the side of the transport Nojima Maru. Both ships locked together, both ships were abandoned, both ships burned. The transport Oigawa Maru, trying to comb torpedo wakes that never existed, turned her broadside to a flight of 3 B-25s. She presented the longest possible target. The B-25s walked their nose guns from her bow to her stern in a single pass. The rounds penetrated her hull and ignited what was stowed in her holds: ammunition, fuel, the personal equipment of 1,300 soldiers. The Oigawa Maru opened down her centerline and went under in less than 4 minutes. Most of the men inside her never reached the deck. The transport Kembu Maru carried 1,000 drums of aviation gasoline for the Japanese air fleet at Leh. A single burst of incendiary rounds found her cargo. The Kembu Maru did not sink so much as she dissolved. The fireball climbed 900 feet above the sea and was visible from Cape Gloucester, 60 miles away. In 15 minutes the work was done. 8 transports either sinking, on fire, or already gone. 4 destroyers, Shirayuki, Tokitsukaze, Arashio, Asashio, destroyed or beyond saving. The 4 surviving destroyers were pulling men out of the water by the hundreds, with the convoy's surface still on fire around them. Admiral Kimura was carried wounded from the Shirayuki to the Shikinami. Shirayuki was scuttled where she lay. But the killing was not over. Late on the afternoon of March 3rd and into the morning of March 4th, the Allied aircraft returned. They strafed the lifeboats. They strafed the survivors in the water. They strafed the rafts, PT boats out of Tufi, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Barry Kay. Atkins moved into the wreckage that night and continued the work the airplanes had begun. Most of the men who flew those final passes did not talk about them when they came home. Some of them never talked about them at all. The decision was defended, then and afterward, on a single ground, that Japanese soldiers pulled from the water would return to a uniform within weeks and would have to be killed again on some beach further north. That argument was made by the men who gave the orders. The men who flew the orders did not always accept the argument, even when they obeyed it. There was a darker reason too, the kind that does not appear in official reports and is preserved instead in the memoirs of the men who were there. According to the account passed down by Allied airmen, and most fully recorded by James Duffy in his book War at the End of the World, a B-17 named Double Trouble, piloted by Lieutenant Woodrow W. Moore had collided with a Japanese Zero earlier that morning. 7 of Moore's crew bailed out. Japanese Zeros, by these same accounts, shot them as they hung in their parachutes in plain view of the other bombers in the formation. The story is not in any official combat report. It is in the memories of the men who said they watched it happen, and the memories of the men who flew back the next day to settle the account in kind. Whether the official record is complete on this point, or whether the men who flew the missions carried truths the paperwork did not record, is a question that has never been fully answered. What is certain is that something happened on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, that the men who came home did not forget. And what is certain is that on the 4th of March, in the water of the Bismarck Sea, mercy was a thing they did not extend. Aboard the Yukikaze, racing north for Rabaul with the last living staff of the 51st Division crowded into every compartment, Lieutenant General Nakano stood at the rail and watched the burning oil slicks recede behind him. He had taken 3,000 of his men into the Bismarck Sea. He was carrying back fewer than half of them. He could not yet know that of the 6,900 soldiers who had sailed from Rabaul, only 1,200 would ever reach Lai. In Brisbane, in a hangar at Eagle Farm, Pappy Gunn heard the first reports come in over the radio room loudspeaker that evening. He listened. He did not say anything. He went outside and stood by himself for a long time, looking at the runway lights coming on against the deepening sky. His wife and his 4 children were in Manila. They had been in Manila for 14 months. He had not heard their voices in all that time. He went back into the hangar. He picked up a wrench. There was another airplane that needed guns in its nose. Rabaul, the evening of March 4th, 1943, the harbour that had launched 8 transports and 8 destroyers 6 days earlier received 4 destroyers back. They came in low in the water, their decks crowded with men who had been pulled from the sea, men still wet, men in burned uniforms, men with the kind of silence on their faces that combat does not produce, but that drowning very nearly does. The fleet medical officer counted the survivors as they came across the gangways. The number he wrote down was 2,734. The number he could not write down, the number the Imperial Japanese Navy would not say aloud for weeks, was the difference between that figure and the 6,900 soldiers who had sailed 5 days earlier. 3,664 men, 3,664 sons, brothers, fathers, husbands. The official Japanese death toll set down on paper by clerks at the 8th Area Army Headquarters who understood the number they were writing. 1,200 soldiers had made it ashore at Lae. 850 of those had been the men the destroyers Asagumo and Yukikaze had pulled from the Kyukushi Maru on the night of March 2nd and run forward at flank speed before the worst of the killing began. The 51st Division, as a fighting formation, had ceased to exist in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the report at his office in the Naval General Staff. He read it twice. He did not speak. He passed it to Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, his Chief of Staff. Fukudome read it, set it down, and wrote in the margin a recommendation that would change the strategic geography of the war. No major surface vessel of the Imperial Japanese Navy, he wrote, should henceforth operate within 500 miles of an American airbase. 500 miles. Look at a map of the South Pacific in March of 1943. Draw a circle 500 miles around Port Moresby. Draw another around Guadalcanal. Draw another around Milne Bay. The circles overlap. Inside those circles lie the sea lanes that fed every Japanese garrison from the Solomons to New Guinea, every island the Imperial Army was holding, every position the Imperial Navy had bought with blood at Coral Sea and Midway and Savo Island. Fukudome's pen had just conceded all of it. What followed was not a campaign. It was a slow strangulation. Japan tried to supply its forward garrisons with submarines, which could carry only a fraction of what a transport could move. Japan tried destroyer runs at night, the Tokyo Express variant they had been using to feed Guadalcanal, but the destroyers could not carry enough either, and they were dying now to American PT boats and American radar that had not existed a year before. Japanese soldiers on New Guinea began to starve in their bunkers. Japanese pilots flew with engine parts that were not replaced. Japanese garrisons watched their rice rations cut in half, then cut again. Lae itself, the place the 51st Division had died trying to reinforce, fell to Australian ground forces in September of 1943. The men who walked into the empty Japanese positions found rifles stacked neatly against the walls and the bones of the defenders inside. In Brisbane, a few days after the Bismarck Sea action, Major Pappy Gunn went to General Kenny's quarters. He brought with him a sheaf of papers. They were a new set of modifications. He wanted to put a 75mm field cannon in the nose of a B-25. Not a machine gun, a cannon, the kind of weapon the United States Army normally fired from a wheeled carriage and a 4-man crew. Kenny looked at the papers. He looked at Gunn. He had stopped asking, by this point in the war, where Pappy Gunn got the things Pappy Gunn needed. The 75mm cannon went into the nose of a B-25 over the next several weeks. The aircraft would be designated, in the production line that followed, the B-25G. Gunn flew the first combat test of the new weapon himself on July 28, 1943. He attacked a Japanese destroyer. The cannon worked after a fashion. The destroyer was finished off afterward by a 1,000-pound bomb. Gunn claimed the kill for his cannon in every official briefing he gave for the rest of the war. Nobody who knew him bothered to correct the record. The cannon was Pappy's. The kill could be his too. In Washington, the engineers at Wright Field, the same engineers who had declared his modifications impossible 6 months earlier, received an order they had not expected. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had been briefed by Kenny on the Bismarck Sea results. 12 modified B-25s, 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, and Empire's logistics shattered in 15 minutes. The engineers tried to explain again that the modifications were impracticable. Arnold listened. Then Arnold ran them out of his office. The story is recorded in Kenny's own memoir. The general did not raise his voice. He simply pointed at the door. "Bring Gunn back to the States," Arnold told Kenny. "Have him teach the engineers." Pappy Gunn, now Lieutenant Colonel, the former Chief Petty Officer with no degree of any kind, was flown back to North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood, California, in the autumn of 1943. He walked into the engineering bay where the men who had pronounced his work impossible were waiting. He pulled out his hand-drawn sketches. He showed them what he had done. He answered their questions in the flat, patient voice of a man who has built something with his own hands and does not need a textbook to explain it. The B-25H went into production with a 75mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns in the nose. The B-25J went into production with the strafer nose gun had built in Brisbane, 8 machine guns forward, package guns on the fuselage, dorsal turret, waist guns, tail guns. Some variants carried as many as 14 50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns. Field modifications pushed the total on a few airplanes as high as 18. The firepower, as one writer would put it after the war, of 3 P-51 Mustangs in formation, all of them firing at once. More than 4,000 B-25Js rolled off the lines at Kansas City before the war was over. Every one of them carried in its bones the work of a man with grease on his hands and a cigarette in his mouth in a hangar at Eagle Farm. What Pappy Gunn did not know during any of this, what he could not know, was what was happening inside the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. 3,000 American and British and Dutch civilians lived behind those walls now. They slept in the lecture halls and the classrooms and on cots in the corridors. They had been there for nearly 3 years. They were hungry. By the autumn of 1944 they were starving. Polly Gunn lived in one room with the 2 girls, Connie and Julie. The boys, Paul Jr. and Nathan, lived in another section of the camp because the Japanese had separated families by sex once the boys were old enough to be considered men. Polly was a small woman. By late 1944 she weighed less than half of what she had on the day the gates of Santo Tomas had closed behind her. She had kept a small photograph of her husband folded inside her Bible. She read the Bible every night by the light that came through the window from the searchlights along the wall. 8 internees in 1 month had died of starvation in Santo Tomas. The Japanese officials had demanded that the death certificates be altered. The word starvation was not to appear. The certificates were rewritten. The boys did what boys do in a place like that. They stole. Paul Jr. was the older one. Nathan was the younger. They went out at night, past the Japanese guards, and they raided the kitchen waste bins where the camp commandant's mess threw out what had been left on the plates. They brought back potato peelings, rice scrapings, fish heads, anything. They carried it back to their mother and their sisters in their pockets and inside their shirts. They could have been shot for it. They went out anyway. They did one more thing. They found a radio in the attic of one of the buildings. Somebody had hidden it there in 1942 and had died or been moved before they could use it. The boys climbed up into that attic almost every night for 2.5 years. They turned the radio on. They listened to the BBC, to the Voice of America, to the Australian service. They wrote down what they heard. They brought it back down into the camp the next morning, and they passed it to the room monitors, who passed it to the other internees, and that was how 3,000 starving prisoners learned what was happening on Guadalcanal, and at Tarawa, and at Saipan, and at Leyte, and in Europe, and at sea. If a Japanese guard had ever climbed into that attic, the boys would have been killed. The boys went up anyway. Father and sons fought the same war. Neither knew the other was still alive. In December of 1944, Pappy Gunn was back in the Pacific. He had been promoted to colonel. He was flying B-25 operations out of Tacloban on the island of Leyte, supporting MacArthur's return to the Philippines. On a clear afternoon at the Tacloban airstrip, a Japanese fighter came in low over the water and strafed the field. Gunn was hit. Shrapnel tore through his left arm and his shoulder. He went down on the matting beside the wing of his airplane. His 9th Purple Heart. The wounds were severe enough to send him home. He fought his way out of the hospital long enough to be in Manila in February of 1945, when the 1st Cavalry Division, the unit they would call the Flying Column, broke into the gates of Santo Tomas on the night of February 3rd. Polly was sitting on her cot. The girls were beside her. She heard the gunfire at the gate. She heard the sound of American voices in the courtyard. She got up. She walked outside. The lights were coming on. The flares were going up. She did not know if her husband was alive. She had not known for over 3 years. He was alive. He was in the city. He came through the gates of Santo Tomas the next morning, walking with a limp and his left arm in a sling. Polly saw him from across the courtyard. He saw her. Neither of them ran. They walked. They walked the way 2 people walk when they are not entirely certain that the person across the courtyard is not a ghost. She weighed barely more than half of what she had weighed the last time he had seen her. The 2 boys came up behind her. Paul Jr., Nathan, the girls, Connie and Julie, were on either side. They were all of them alive. All 6 of them, 3 of them too thin to recognize at a distance. He did not cry where anyone could see him. Pappy Gunn was not that kind of man. He cried later. He cried in private. Polly never told anyone what he said to her that morning. Some things are not for the historical record. The Gunns came home. Pappy retired from the Army Air Forces on June 30th, 1948, as a full colonel on physical disability from his wounds. He rebuilt Philippine Airlines. The 4 Beechcraft 18s he had flown out of Manila in 1941 had not survived the war. He bought new aircraft. He went back to the work he had loved before the world had gone insane. On October 11th, 1957, 12 years and 8 months after the liberation of Santo Tomas, Pappy Gunn took off in a chartered Beechcraft 18 from a small field in the southern Philippines. A storm closed over the mountain pass he was flying through. The aircraft did not come out the other side. There were no survivors. He died in the country where his family had been imprisoned. He died flying the same kind of red airplane he had built his life around. He died, the records say, less than 300 miles from the gates of Santo Tomas. He is buried at Barrancas National Cemetery, Pensacola, Florida. Section 15, row 0, grave 5. The marker says nothing about B-25s. It says nothing about the 8-gun nose. It does not mention the Bismarck C. It gives his name. It gives his dates. It gives his rank. That is all. In his memoir, written in 1959, General George Churchill Kenny called Paul Irvin Gunn the most important man in the 5th Air Force. The 5th Air Force, during the years Kenny commanded it, sank more than 800 Japanese ships and destroyed more than 2,000 Japanese aircraft on the ground. The number of Japanese soldiers killed by aircraft built or modified to Gunn's specifications has been estimated by some accounts at as many as 85,000. The exact figure cannot be verified. The order of magnitude is not disputed. He never received the Medal of Honor. He received 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts. Some of those Purple Hearts he never bothered to pin on. They were in a cigar box in his bedroom when he died. The 8-gun nose he built in a hangar at Eagle Farm in 1942, built with parts stolen from wrecked fighters, built without authorization, built against the written advice of the engineers who had designed the airplane, became the standard armament of every American gunship aircraft that followed. The lineage runs forward in a straight line. The AC-47 Spooky over Vietnam, the AC-130 Spectre over Laos and Cambodia and Iraq and Afghanistan. The A-10 Warthog with its 30mm rotary cannon that has been killing tanks in the deserts of 2 generations of war. Every one of them stands downstream of a former chief petty officer, working in a tropical hangar with a wrench in his hand and grease on his sleeves, trying to build something that would help him get home to his wife. He never said it that way. He was not a man who said much at all. But 6,900 Japanese soldiers sailed from Rabaul on the 28th of February 1943, and 1,200 of them reached Lae. The difference between those two numbers was Papigun's answer. It was not the only answer he gave during the war. It was the loudest. A question worth carrying away from this story, the kind of question men our age sometimes ask each other late in the evening when the talk turns serious. Could it still happen today? Could a man without a degree, working out of a hangar with a wrench and a sketch on the back of a cigarette pack, change the course of a war the way Papigun changed his? The world has gotten very large since 1942. The arsenals have gotten very specialized. The engineers have gotten very certain that they are the ones who know. But there was a time when a former enlisted sailor from Quitman, Arkansas, looked at an airplane that wasn't doing what it needed to do and decided he would make it do that thing with whatever tools he had on the bench in front of him. He made it work. He came home to his family. He is buried in Florida now. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn. They called him Pappy. If this story moved you, if you learned something here you did not know before, the like button under this video tells the algorithm to put Papigun's name in front of one more person who has never heard it. Subscribe if you want more of these, the buried stories, the men whose work changed everything but whose names the textbooks left out. And down in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if your father or your uncle or your grandfather flew B-25s in the Pacific, or served in the 5th Air Force, or came home from a place they never spoke about afterward. This channel is built by the people watching it. You are part of how these names stay alive. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure that the man who built the 8-gun nose in a hangar at Eagle Farm, a man who never asked for credit and rarely got it, is remembered for exactly what he was. Not just an improviser, not just a mechanic with good ideas, the man whose hands, working in a tropical heat 83 years ago, helped to end an empire. The 8-gun nose changed everything. 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea proved it. And now, because you watched this all the way through, you know exactly how it happened, and you know exactly who made it possible.